Cork, from 1919 to 1920, was the most violent and volatile county in Ireland. At the epicentre was the city itself. All aspects of life in Cork City were deeply impacted by these turbulent times, an era defined by social and political engagement and change, challenging conditions, conflicting loyalties and immense loss. In this charged environment, women played an increasingly critical role.
Cork was a bustling university city at the turn of the 20th century, and women had more access then to education than their mothers or their grandmothers would have had. It was also a time when there was more avenues open to them for engagement in politics and society. Cultural nationalist organisations like the Gaelic League welcomed women into its ranks. They could also be members of Sinn Féin or members of Cumann na mBan after the branches opened in the city in 1914. That year also, of course, so many of the women of the city waved off brothers or sons to fight in the trenches of World War I. Other women became involved in the suffrage movement, and women gained the right to vote in parliamentary elections, of course, in 1918. In 1920, you were talking about the Irish War of Independence period, where there was heightened tensions, more possibility of violence against people and property. It was a difficult time, a time also of a housing crisis, of food shortages, even a typhus epidemic in the autumn of 1920. Women certainly had more engagement in politics and society at this time. They were more active, but it was also a time when they had to endure more. It was a time of war and revolution.
A woman who came to know grief and anxiety firsthand was the Lady Mayoress of Cork, Eilish McCurtain.
Tomás McCurtain was one of the greatest Cork Republican icons of the Irish Revolution. Commander of the Cork No. 1 Brigade of the IRA and Lord Mayor of Cork City, the entire nation was shocked by his untimely killing on the 20th of March 1920. While his story is well known, that of his wife Eilish sadly has disappeared through the mist of time. Born in the Mardyke at the end of the 19th century as Elizabeth Walsh, if anyone personifies the two words engagement and endurance, it would be Eilish.
Her family were actually Fenians of old, and her great-grandaunt and uncle had been run out of Ireland as Fenians. The family themselves were immersed in their desire for Irish freedom as well, not just when she met Tomás, but before that. Actually, she met him at a meeting of the Gaelic League, where they were teaching Irish, so she wanted to brush up on her Irish. Her brother Tommy had been in jail in and out quite a lot, and he actually fired the first shot in the Rising in 1916, and her brother Jimmy again had been in prison quite a number of occasions. Very early on, she had a great interest in Irish culture and the Irish language, and I think when she met my grandfather, it was with him that both of them sort of developed what was their deep feeling for Irish freedom. They grew on that path together.
After the 1916 Rising, which was a failure here in Cork for a number of reasons, her husband was arrested, sent over to Britain, and while away, he spent many long nights soul-searching over the failure of his unit to participate. And during those long, dark days, he was sustained by the love of Eilish.
Before she was Lady Mayoress, she had a very difficult time because my grandfather was in exile. She kept the business at the mill going when he was involved in the volunteer movement. So she was quite a brain behind the business as well. And when the war broke out, it was she had to turn around and pay the women, and when Tomás was in jail, actually had to put up with the abuse from a lot of the women. She showed that, you could stand not behind your man, but with your man, if you know what I mean. Like, she was never the shadow really behind my grandfather. She supported him and was with him every step of the way.
In late January 1920, in the Cork City local elections, Tomás McCurtain, running as the Sinn Féin candidate, polled the highest vote in the city. On the 30th of January, he was appointed as the first Republican Lord Mayor of Cork.
He was really on a hit list, and he had got some death threats, and she never asked him to back down. A lesser woman might have talked him out of taking office or even going to work the nights that he had the death threats, but she didn't. She backed him all the way.
Well, in the week preceding the 20th of March, there had been a lot of violent activity here in the city of Cork. And in the early hours of the 20th of March, Tomás McCurtain had just returned home in 40 Thomas Davis Street, having attended a meeting of his brigade officers. And shortly after 1 o'clock, there was a loud banging on the door and shouts. So he offered to come down the stairs, but Eilish said, "No, you stay put, Tomás, and I'll answer the door." And when she opened the door, she was met by a group of angry, agitated men with blackened faces, some of whom were wearing masks. They pushed their way past her, pinned her up against the wall, a couple of them, and while others ran up the stairs outside their bedroom, shouting at her husband to come out. And when he did, he was met by a volley of shots and he collapsed on the ground. The men made their escape. They ran out the door, pushed her out of the way again, and in one last act of terror, so to speak, they pointed their revolvers at the home and fired a few shots at the window to stop anybody looking out. When Eilish recovered her composure, she went up the stairs and found her husband lying in a pool of blood, surrounded by some of his children and his in-laws, her sisters and brother. That would have been traumatic at the best of times, but it must have been even more difficult for a pregnant woman at the time.
She was the one shouting instructions for doctors to get a priest, and then she prayed with them. And very strong woman, because her last words to him were, "Remember, it's for Ireland." And his last words then were, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." I mean, they were a very religious couple, but she was resigned to the fact that, her husband had died, but it was for the greater cause.
Shortly after her husband was killed, his funeral took place. There was a funeral mass above the North Cathedral, followed by a massive procession through the streets of Cork, and his burial in the Republican plot in St. Finbarr's Cemetery.
The spotlight of the world was now on her. She was very low profile at that time. I mean, she went in a carriage behind the walkers to the funeral, and she had to sit for most of the ceremony at actually the graveside.
Throughout that entire process, throughout the mass, the procession, and indeed the burial, Eilish conducted herself with great dignity, and in many respects she became the public face of the grief and mourning felt by the citizens of Cork for their slain Lord Mayor.
She always felt that not only did they murder her husband that night, but her twin girls were stillborn, and she really felt that there were 3 murders and not 1.
In many respects, she represented the loss, the grief and the suffering of so many women in the city, so many widows who would have lost a husband in the horrors of the First World War, or indeed in the turmoil of the Irish Revolution.
But the values that my grandfather listed out when he was elected mayor was really both their values in life, is the way I could probably explain it, because she was very much his confidant. There was nothing went on that she didn't know about. Even like when the manifesto was issued, it was home to her that he came and discussed it. And even when they were meeting with Terence McSweeney, it was around the kitchen table, of which she was there too. It wasn't like the men went off and discussed it. So, and of course, when the volunteers were in and out all the time, it was into her home.
Throughout her entire life, Eilish McCurtain remained a committed Republican. It's something she passed on to her own children, and her belief in an independent, free, united Irish Republic is something she carried with her to her grave. Today, the contribution to the cause of Irish freedom and the sacrifice made by Tomás McCurtain is commemorated in many different ways. His portrait hangs on the Lord Mayor's office. There's a bust to him outside City Hall, and there's a street named after him. And that's as it should be. But it's equally important to remember the part played by his wife Eilish and how she supported her husband and the contribution she made to the wider fight for Irish freedom during that turbulent period.
Key witnesses to Tomás's tragic death were the McCurtains' closest neighbours, the Duggans, an extremely politically active Cork family during these times.
The Duggan family lived on 49 Thomas Davis Street, which is in the heart of Blackpool, and across the way would have been the McCurtain household where Tomás and Eilish and their family lived. So they were witnesses to the attack on the McCurtain household and to the shots being fired at Tomás on that night. And she was a witness to him drawing his last breath. She was a witness to the trauma in the household and the heartache that went through it that night. And she was also, along with her sister, the person who went for the curate who came to administer the last rites to Tomás. The Duggan sisters, Peg, Sorcha, or Sarah as she was known, Bridget, Breed and Annie, were very, very close. The Cumann movement, the growth of it in Cork, in city and county, the Duggan sisters had a huge role to play in that. Now, there were other women involved, but the Duggan sisters in particular were very involved. They became politicised really, I would say, even from about 1910, 1911 on. They came from a household where their parents were very interested in the question of Irish independence, in the question of the Irish language. So they drew their spirit of the fight for Irish freedom from that household.
My grandmother was one of the Duggan sisters. My grandmother was Breed, and she would have been my mother's mother. Like a lot of people, they had been attending Gaelic League classes and so on. And then when Cumann was set up, they became involved.
Peg herself, Peg Duggan, was in at the very ground with Mary McSweeney, May Conlon, and a number of the other key organisers. Bertie Conway was another one. After 1916, Mary McSweeney called a meeting of the Cumann in Undune, which was below in Queen Street, and asked the women that were there, including the Duggan sisters, did they want to go on with the fight now that Cumann was proscribed. And the majority of women there, including all the Duggan sisters, dedicated themselves to the fight for freedom, even though they knew Cumann now was proscribed, so they could be arrested at any moment, they could be stopped and searched. All of that sort of thing was an issue for them.
When you consider some of the things that happened, I mean, the house being used as a rendezvous, the house occasionally being used to store arms, Peg's shop on Parliament Street being used as a place to dump arms and so on. So I think they were very politically aware, were very politically active.
The dynamic between the sisters was, we're in this for the long road, and whatever it costs us, we'll stay with it. Annie Duggan refers quite a bit to the hardships they underwent, she and her sisters, in storing weaponry in not just their house, but in Peg Duggan's floristry shop for the volunteers, because it put their businesses at risk and it put their homes at risk, and they were subjected to many raids.
I mean, they were very close to the RIC barracks in Blackpool, and the house was marked. At one stage, my great-grandfather was taken out of the house and threatened with execution.
Their brother was arrested during the War of Independence and wasn't released until the general amnesty around the truce time in 1921. So their family felt it very deeply. Tensions upped all the time, and their involvement in it increased exponentially because of that. The treaty, when it came, and it was much longed for, but when it came between December and January 1921-22, it was to cause great upheaval. And the Duggan sisters were no different from anybody else in the country. One can only imagine the arguments backwards and forwards in that household over the pros and cons of the treaty. And also because of the organisation they were involved in, Cumann, it was having the same heartfelt debate.
Like lots of families, it happened that people took different sides. Peg and Annie would have been pro-treaty. My grandmother was definitely anti-treaty. I don't know what position exactly the others took up, but I suspect it was an anti-treaty position. My memory is that the personal relationships at that, were still quite good, even though they had taken opposite sides. I suspect an agreement to just, we differed and let's not talk about it.
Sorcha Duggan herself refers to it as that awful time, that tragic time. Again, I'm paraphrasing now from her pension application. What she was trying to say was it was such a tragedy for the country and for the city of Cork and for their family, that all that they had hoped for, all that they had geared themselves politically for, was now becoming infused with bitterness and hostility, and it was breaking down as to which side you took over the treaty, and then did you fight in the Civil War, which side did you take, and all of that. And that proved very, very difficult for them. In the course of her witness statement to the Bureau of Military Archives, Peg Duggan gives a brilliant summary of what she and her family, and indeed her sisters, contributed to the cause for Irish freedom. And I'll just read from that now. I and my sisters devoted every spare moment of our time to harbouring wanted men, carrying ammunition and guns for the IRA, visiting prisoners in jails, providing comforts for them, carrying dispatches, and, in general, assisting by every means in our power in the fight for freedom. We were engaged in these activities when the Truce of July 1921 came.
That's one of the, I suppose, the remarkable features was the role which women occupied in that period, and then sort of post, with the establishment of the Free State government, you know, it was a question of, you all go back into the box now.
For the Duggan sisters, who had been very strong, independent women and remained so all their lives, I wonder what they thought about the Ireland that was growing up, you know. Would they have had qualms about the limits that were being put on women? Socially and culturally, what was expected of women was beginning to become very narrow and very rigid. How would they have reacted to that?
South of Blackpool, towards the city centre, on St Patrick's Hill, is St Angela's College. Here Geraldine Neeson received her education. Geraldine represented women from the privileged socio-economic class in a city of social extremes. During the 1920s, the musician, journalist and active member of Cumann na mBan was an eyewitness to some of the landmark events of the Irish Revolutionary period.
Geraldine Neeson was born into the wealthy Catholic mercantile class in Cork City at the turn of the century, and her father Daniel was a wine and tea merchant, and he brought up his 8 children at, I think, 41 Sundayswell Road, and Sundayswell was very much the preserve of that wealthy middle class elite during that time. And I suppose her childhood was replete with things that came along with that sort of social standing.
They were very varied. They were all allowed, which was unusual at the time, they were all allowed to do what they wanted to do. My mother became a musician, of course, and one of her sisters was a doctor. The others did what was normal at the time and got married first before doing anything.
Geraldine showed a very early talent for music, and that was nurtured by her family. Both her parents organised that she receive piano lessons from the renowned teacher Tilly Fleischmann. Her experience in childhood was quite typical of that class at that time. Geraldine's formative years in Cork would have been from, I suppose, 1900 to 1911, when she was about 16 years old. And she attended St Angela's College. And actually Terence MacSweeney's sister, Mary MacSweeney, would have been one of her teachers there. It was also during Geraldine's teenage years that she formed a friendship with Muriel Murphy of the very influential Murphy's Brewing family in Cork City. And their friendship was forged along the lines of a shared interest in music, and, as Geraldine herself would have said, a certain independence of thought. There would have been an awful lot of opportunity for both Geraldine and Muriel Murphy to move in circles that might have included, for example, Terence MacSweeney, the Stockleys, an awful lot of people who were involved in that cultural nationalist movement of the time. So I think everybody is familiar with that wonderful sepia image of the wedding of Muriel Murphy and Terence MacSweeney that took place, I think, in June 1917, while Terence MacSweeney was interned in England in a small village in Hertfordshire. And you can see in the photograph that with the newly married couple, you have Geraldine Neeson, who was there as Muriel's bridesmaid. You also have both of Terence MacSweeney's sisters, Annie and Mary, and of course Richard Mulcahy attended as his best man. There's a wonderful story about how both Geraldine Neeson and Muriel Murphy had to smuggle over Terence MacSweeney's uniform, his volunteer uniform, which in fact he wore then during the wedding ceremony.
My mother did things she believed in, and she believed that Terence and Muriel were meant to be, and she helped them as best she could.
Following the shocking murder of Tomás McCurtain, his dear friend and deputy, Terence MacSweeney was elected as the Lord Mayor of Cork on the 30th of March 1920.
Cork City's Republican Lord Mayor, Terence McSweeney, was arrested in August 1920. He was lodged immediately in Cork Men's Jail, where he embarked on a hunger strike. He was then transferred over to Brixton Prison in London, where he continued the hunger strike. And coincidentally, Geraldine Neeson happened to be in London at the same time, and she was seeking a permit to study music in Germany. And she received word that Terence was going to be transferred to London. So she happened to be on the spot when Terence's family, his sisters and his wife, of course, Geraldine's friend Muriel, arrived in the city. So you can imagine that Geraldine, who of course was Muriel's good friend, would have been enormous, emotional support for Muriel during what must have been an incredibly difficult time. Geraldine recounts actually gaining access into Terence McSweeney's cell during his hunger strike, and she did have an opportunity to exchange some words with Terence before those terrible last moments on the 25th of October, when he finally succumbed after 74 days on hunger strike. Less than 2 months after Terence McSweeney died in October, Geraldine was actually present at another sort of pivotal moment during the Irish War of Independence, and that of course was the burning of Cork on the night of the 11th and 12th of December 1920. That night, Geraldine had been attending, I think, a performance of the Gondoliers in the Opera House in Cork City with her sister Una and Sean Neeson, who would have been her fiancé at that time. And they were coming out of the Opera House and walking along the quays towards Patrick Street, and shocked to discover the sight of a burning tram on Patrick's Bridge. And that, of course, was the opening scene of what became a night of devastation, of arson and looting and turmoil perpetrated by forces of the Crown as reprisal for an action that was taken by the IRA in Dillon's Cross earlier that night. As an active member of Cumann na mBan at the time, and Sean Neeson, of course, was an IRA intelligence officer in Cork at the time, the last thing they wanted to do was to be caught in that context. So they made a very quick U-turn, went back along the quays, over Northgate Bridge up to Sundays Well. So Geraldine, the distinguished and talented classical pianist that she was, continued to give recitals and performances even during that terrible time of the height of the War of Independence in Cork, when people were dealing with curfew and heightened tensions. And there's one particular performance that she remembers in Clarence Hall in the Imperial Hotel in the latter stages of the Irish War of Independence. And she didn't expect there to be very many people there, and the hall was packed. And she talked about how that was obviously people wanting to attend a performance like that as a sort of means of diversion or in relief of some of the tension in the city at the time. And she herself, of course, was very tense because, again, an active member of Cumann na mBan, she received word after the performance that 2 British soldiers who were in attendance at the performance would like to meet her. So she was quite nervous going up to meet them, and in fact very relieved when she discovered that all they wanted to do was to compliment her on her performance.
Most women of that class at that time would not have worked at all. And she performed. She was a classical pianist, very, very talented, I understand. Later on, she became a teacher, as one had to in this country. You couldn't live as a classical pianist at that time in Ireland. She really was totally involved in all the cultural side of the city. She loved Cork. Cork was her place, and she was of Cork, and very proud indeed.
Geraldine Neeson's relationship with Cork City is founded on music and culture. The landmarks of her life are very much testimony to that. They begin in Sundays Well, where she received music lessons from Tilly Fleischman, down to Wellington Road, where she taught music in St. Ida's. Sean became the director of 6CK, which was the very first radio station outside of Dublin in Ireland. The location was the old women's jail in Sundays Well, which was where, of course, Sean was imprisoned for a while during the Civil War. Sean gained assistant lecturership in the School of Music, later a lecturership in Irish music in UCC. Their association with the plays and drama of the Cork Drama League and the Opera House, all of this placed Sean and Geraldine Neeson at the very influential centre of a vibrant cultural community in Cork City in the years, certainly after the War of Independence and the Civil War. And a beautifully, I suppose, poignant but fitting last resting place for Sean and Geraldine is in the Musicians' Corner in St. Finbarr's Cemetery in Cork City.
Not far from Sunday as well, up in Shandon is St Anne's Cathedral and Shandon Bells Tower. It was in this community that the women of Cork best remember another unsung heroine of the era, Dr. Mary Hearn, a physician and philanthropist whose outstanding career developed in the 1920s.
Not all women who made a contribution to Cork society during the turbulent years of the Irish Revolution did so by political or military means. Countless women made their contribution simply by raising their family and keeping the family home together, while others made their contribution through means of their profession. One professional woman who made a huge, significant contribution to Cork life during that period and in the subsequent years was the physician and gynecologist Dr. Mary Hearn. Born in February 1891, she was the daughter of William Ashley Cummins, a professor of medicine in University College Cork, and his wife Jane. Mary had decided to follow in her father's footsteps and to study medicine in University College Cork. Like many young women, and indeed many families, Mary would experience a huge sense of grief and loss when two of her brothers, Harry and Fenton, were killed in action during the First World War while fighting with the British Army. And this is a sense of loss and grief that she would carry with her for her entire life. Despite the fact that she was a first-class student, her studies were destined to be interrupted by romance. She met and fell in love with a Church of Ireland rector by the name of Robert Hearn, who actually served in this church here in St Anne's here in Cork. Romance blossomed. After a courtship, the couple were married and they would go on to have two children, Robert and Elise. In the years that followed, Robert Sr. would actually go on to be appointed the Church of Ireland Bishop of the Diocese of Cork, Cloyne and Ross.
When Mary would have come here to St Finbarr's Cathedral, she would have sat approximately where I am standing, and she would have been able to see her husband either in the bishop's throne here or at the high altar. But also she would have been able to see the memorial panel where her two brothers killed in the First World War are listed. And we can only imagine what it must have been like sitting in this spot, looking at the panel on the memorial and seeing her two brothers' names every time she came here to worship. It must have been very difficult for her.
When she started doing medicine, she got married and stopped for a couple of years, but her husband encouraged her to get back into medicine again. And even when she had her children, she kept going and still had support. And that is where so many people in those days often fell out of a career. And it's wonderful to think of her son coming as a toddler to her conferring in UCC. That must have really been quite something.
After acquiring her doctorate, in 1923 she secured a position as a physician in the Victoria Hospital in Cork, and that was a place that would feature very largely in her life.
She was an honorary physician to the Victoria Hospital, so while private patients paid her, the public patients did not. They were seen, because she was the honorary physician there. There was little support from the state. A huge amount of it could really have been described as virtually charity work. And she had a clinic for women in this area, which, as far as I know, again, was virtually free to patients and must have made such a huge difference to them.
Well, Mary's great contribution, I suppose, to social justice in the city would be the very fact that she treated all patients, irrespective of class, creed, and more importantly, economic circumstances.
Well, at this side of the city up here in Shandon, she was very well respected because it didn't matter who they were or what. If they contacted her, she looked after them.
I don't remember the first time I met her because Dr. Mary Hearn delivered me into this world. My mother was a patient of hers in the Glenveary nursing home where I was born, and my brother and sister as well. Dr. Mary Hearn was one of the few women doctors in Ireland at that time, and my mother always felt that she was such a good obstetrician because she'd had children herself, and that this gave her a special cachet, which of course male obstetricians couldn't have. She was a pioneer in her field, and she was a pioneer as well in the fact that she knew that women badly needed help. Remember, Cork was a pretty poor place in those days, And a lot of the women who would have been pregnant would have maybe suffered from malnutrition, tuberculosis, rheumatic heart disease, so they weren't easy cases to be taken care of. And as well as that, of course, there was no contraception, no family planning, and some of the women would have had very large families, and as the number of their children went on, the risks became greater. So her skill was much appreciated by the women of this area, many of whom were delivered by her in their own homes.
She spoke to everybody on their level. I mean, you would never think that she had gone through college and, you know, we were all the same to her.
Meeting her and having been treated by her had a huge influence on me doing medicine. And because she was a most inspiring woman, when one saw the way she dealt with patients and the kindness she gave to everyone, you couldn't but be impressed by her. So she was a huge influence on my life.
In her time, definitely a leading light in the city.
Mary Hearn lived on St. Patrick's Hill, right in the heart of the city that she loved so well. On the 3rd of June 1969, she passed away in the Victoria Hospital, the place where she spent so much of her professional career. And in 2011, this old cemetery was converted into a public park and named the Dr. Mary Hearn Park. And today it serves as a fitting memorial to a woman of compassion and faith who lived through the Irish Revolution and whose generosity of spirit touched the lives of so many people in this city.
These extraordinary women and their stories, along with so many others untold, shaped this crucial period in Cork City's history, a time of dramatic transformation and social upheaval.
Had they not survived that generation, we wouldn't be the people we are now either, because if the women all caved in, what would you have a society of women today? I mean, we all look to our grandparents, our parents and our grandparents, and you know, times are bad, you draw strength from what they went through. They gave Cork City, and especially after the fire in 1920, I mean, the whole city, the shopkeepers, everyone got together again, and a lot of those were women. It wasn't just men. It was the women as well that had to, you know, get the show back on the road.
These four women highlighted really how extraordinary they were in the times that they were living in. They're representative of women not just in Cork City, but women who were all over Ireland and who were doing what they could to engage with the society that they lived in and endure difficulties that they were coming up against. There were women who got on with their daily lives and then were called to act in certain ways in each of their individual lives, to step up to the plate either politically, culturally, family-wise, in face of great tragedy, and indeed in their careers to have to fight and go against the grain. The fact that they almost deviated into the shadows of Irish life, and in the recording of their stories, that's an indictment of us really, that we forgot about them, we allowed them to go into the shadows, and it's only now, and that is one of the great things about the decade of centenary, is that we're putting a spotlight on what did the women do anyway, to quote Lil Conlon of the then Shandon Cumann. What did the women do anyway? Hopefully that we'll never ever have to ask that question again. It will be a matter of course that our children will know the story of what the women contributed to Irish and Cork society as much as what the men did.